The most important thing to be said about the 1980 Constitution is that it was the creature of crime. It came out of the referendum of 1978, and the referendum of 1978 was perceived locally and internationally as an abominable crime against the Guyanese people. As we have it now, was written entirely by the People's National Congress and foisted onto the Guyanese people through the referendum of 1978. This is the key fact to remember. It is, to my mind, extremely disappointing that the People's Progressive Party, which had played such a vital role in the mobilization, the national mobilization against that referendum and against what we all at that time called the slave constitution of 1980, should in fact be taking quite so long to bring themselves to the question of constitutional reform. We had heard even then that perhaps there were aspects of the 1980 Constitution that were not that unacceptable. To my mind, the most unacceptable feature of that Constitution had to do with the process that yielded it up. We must remove this crime and rewrite the 1980 Constitution as a moral duty. We have a moral duty to dispose of this Constitution. And we are not persuaded by arguments that say that this section of the Constitution is perhaps acceptable and that aspect is unacceptable. People have been focusing, quite rightly, on the extraordinary powers of the executive president. But the powers of the president really are only one obnoxious feature of the 1980 Constitution. It has many other obnoxious features. But to my mind, the most crucial dimension that we need to address is that the Constitution was in fact the creature of a criminal process, and that is a matter that needs to be addressed and addressed swiftly. Organizations of the opposition at that time, the People's Progressive Party, the Workers' Alliance, the Vanguard for Liberation and Democracy, which was made up of 3 smaller opposition parties, came together at the initiative of the Working People's Alliance in the Committee in Defense of Democracy to resist that referendum. And the resistance against the referendum, if I may say so, was extremely successful. Independent monitors who monitored the referendum of July 10, 1978, pointed to the fact that less than 13% of the population had actually voted, and let it be said at once that the most important feature of the mobilization against the referendum of 1978 was the fact that for the very first time since 1953, the 2 major race groups in this country took the same position on a single political question. The mobilization was across class, it was across race, it was a national resistance to the referendum in which the PPP played a major role. At the time of the Committee in Defense of Democracy, the non-political organizations, the trade unions, the professional associations, including the lawyers, the teachers, the nurses, the architects, the engineers, had come together in what was then called the Citizens Committee. The Citizens Committee had mobilized from a non-political point of view, had mobilized its own constituents and its own membership and so on, and had itself waged an independent struggle against that referendum. And it was on the eve of the referendum itself that the Committee in Defense of Democracy, which was made up then of the political parties, the Working People's Alliance, the People's Progressive Party, the Vanguard for Liberation and Democracy, the People's Democratic Movement, had come together with other organizations in the CDD and carried out a political campaign. It was on the eve of the referendum that the CDD and the Citizens Committee came together, joined their forces, and called for a joint boycott of that referendum. The boycott was extremely successful. Independent monitors at the time reckoned that no more than 13% of the Guyanese people had in fact voted. This, of course, did not prevent Mr. Burnham, who was extremely brazen, from announcing that over 70% or 79% of the people had voted, and of those people, he had won 90% of the vote. This was widely perceived as extremely ludicrous. Everybody knew that the streets of the country were completely deserted on referendum day. The boycott was extremely successful. There was industrial action to go along with that boycott. Bauxite workers had called strikes in the mining community. The CCW had led an industrial resistance in the city. And we know that in the wake of the referendum, a number of workers associated with the CCW and a number of the leading bauxite activists were in fact dismissed. The referendum was in fact, held in lieu of holding the elections in 1978. Mr. Burnham, as we all know, had rigged the elections of 1973 and rigged them massively. That all the devices that he had, in fact, refined from 1968, overseas voting, proxy voting, and so on, multiple voting, all of these things have, in fact, come back in 1973 and come back with a vengeance. This was also the election where the Guyana Defence Force had seized the ballot boxes, where people had been shot down in the quarantine, activists of the People's Progressive Party attempting to resist. These facts are well known and are part of the electoral history of the country. Elections were then due in 1978. After the massive rigging of the 1973 elections, people wondered, well, what was Mr. Burnham going to do next? Little did we know what Mr. Burnham had up his sleeve. Mr. Burnham, in fact, intended to hold no elections in 1978. What he intended to do was to postpone those elections, go for an extension of the life of the government, which was duly extended and went on from 1978 to 1980. The elections that were due in 1978 were duly postponed. Instead, he brought the referendum of July the 10th, and that extended the life of Parliament. Parliament converted itself into a constituent assembly, received memoranda, and the only memorandum, in fact, that it received was the draft constitution of the PNC. The second thing to understand about the 1980 constitution is that it was the constitution prepared solely by the People's National Congress. No other organization in Guyana, not even the Trade Unions Congress, which, against all our advice, had gone into the Constituent Assembly. And later on, they were to complain that not a single comma of their proposals had found their way into the 1980 Constitution. The 1980 Constitution, as we have it now, was written entirely by the People's National Congress and foisted onto the Guyanese people through the referendum of 1978. This is the key factor.